Souci, how the devil kept Jean-Baptiste Beaugrand from being hanged for murder during the War of 1812. The War of 1812, sometimes called Mr. Madison's War or the Second War of Independence, is one of America's most obscure and forgotten wars, and to its participants it had different meanings. For Great Britain, it was a burdensome sideshow to its greater struggle against Napoleonic France. For Canadian peoples, it was American aggression in its purest form. For Native Americans, it was a chance to gain ethnic and cultural survival. And for American citizens, it was a confused war with divided loyalties between the merchant class in New England and the war hawks in the West. But whether forgotten or not, this war was particularly hard fought in the Detroit River region, where American frontier settlers viewed their troubles with the Indians as the result of British intrigue. The most disastrous military action of the war, in terms of numbers of soldiers killed, wounded, and missing, was the battles of the River Raisin, also called Frenchtown, fought between January 18th and January 23rd, 1813, which is now Monroe, Michigan. The River Raisin massacre of some 40 to 60 volunteers of General James Winchester's Kentucky Brigade was the scene of Jean-Baptiste Beaugrand's murder of a Kentucky volunteer as a captive prisoner of hundreds taken by Native Americans on the road to Detroit and Fort Malden, Canada. Julia C. Altracchi's 1940 novel titled Wolves Against the Moon tells the story of adventurous Frenchmen on the old Northwest frontier from 1796 to 1815. Though the characters are fictitious, they seem real, especially her character Jacques Beaugrand at the River of Death. She blends fact, fiction, and legend about Beaugrand's murder of an unknown Kentucky soldier captured by the Indians on a forced march to Detroit and Fort Malden, Canada. The events are real but cloaked in a fictitious writing style. Beaugrand was one of those wolves against the moon who adapted to British and American rule for self-preservation and survival as an American militiaman and merchant, but an often despised ethnic French minority by both colonial powers, Great Britain and the United States. There is no photograph of Jean-Baptiste Beaugrand since photography was not invented until the 1840s, and he died in 1826. Likewise, there are no known portrait sketches or silhouettes of him, but perhaps one can see Beaugrand's likeness in a photograph shown here left in the slide of his son Jean-Pierre Beaugrand, called Peter, who was born in 1814 and died in 1915 in Lower Sandusky, now Fremont, Ohio. At the time of Peter's death, he was credited by local and national newspapers as the oldest living doctor of medicine. Peter had served in the American Civil War as surgeon of the 169th Ohio Volunteers Infantry. At right in the slide is the carte de visite, or photograph, of Margaret Chabert de Joncaire Beaugrand, born 1782 and died 1859. This is a tintype image in a case of two wooden halves with brass hinge hooks, glass over the photograph on the front half, and pink or light purplish satin lining on the other half. The inscription on the verso is by her granddaughter, Estelle Rawson Russell, dated April 30th, 1882. Marguerite Beaugrand was Peter's mother and Jean-Baptiste's wife. Jean-Baptiste and Marguerite Beaugrand's children were 4 sons and 4 daughters. Pictured here in the slide are the daughters Helen, Margaret, Julia, and Sophia. Jean-Baptiste Beaugrand was sitting in Detroit jail in August 1814 for murder of a Kentucky volunteer on January 23, 1813, after the massacre at the River Raisin. The trial would be held in John Kinsey's house in October 1814. Many things must have come to mind as he pondered his gloomy dilemma of life and death. Perhaps he recalled being caught in the middle of British, American, and Indian hostilities when his store at the Maumee River Rapids was destroyed during the Battle of Fallen Timbers on August 20th, 1794. Or when history repeated itself again 18 years later in 1812, when his store was looted by a detachment of British and Native Americans. And certainly he thought about all the destruction on the River Raisin wrought by the British and Indians in the massacre at Frenchtown in 1813, of which he and Godefroy lost property. Gabriel Godefroy Sr. and Jean-Baptiste Beaugrand of the firm Godefroy and Beaugrand were French-speaking merchants and militiamen who owned land in Detroit, the Huron River, River Rouge, River Raisin, and the Maumee River from 1790 to 1812. They had stores at the same places, selling commercial goods to Native Americans, fur traders, and Euro-Americans. They were less wealthy and less urbane than the Anglo-French merchants of Detroit. They catered to the rural countryside in peripheral settlements south of Detroit. The War of 1812 delivered the coup de grace to the firm and saw Godefroy indicted for treason and Beaugrand for murder by the United States. Beaugrand probably thought about the decisive battle at River Raisin on January 22, 1813, that set his subsequent fate in motion. Here, Major General William Henry Harrison, commander of the U.S. Northwestern Army after General William Hall's surrender of Detroit, believed he could retake Detroit during the winter of 1812-1813. Harrison's winter campaign was stopped cold when Brigadier General James Winchester's command of 880 regulars and militia volunteers suffered a defeat and disaster between January 18th and 23rd of 1813 at Frenchtown by a superior British and Indian force of 1,800, supported by artillery under Colonel Henry Proctor from Fort Malden, Canada. Winchester had disobeyed an order by Harrison not to move to Frenchtown, but to remain at the Maumee Rapids. The aftermath of the Frenchtown affair resulted in the loss of 800 American soldiers, 522 captured, consisting of 35 officers and 487 enlisted men by the British, 148 killed, lost, and captured by the Indians, who were the decisive factor in winning the battle, 65 seriously wounded, and 33 escaped. British losses consisted of 24 killed and 158 wounded out of 524 soldiers. Indian losses are unknown. The American Army's disaster at Frenchtown delayed the invasion of Canada on the western frontier by almost a year, until the nation obtained naval superiority over the British on the Great Lakes in September of 1813. This slide shows General Winchester being captured by the Roundhead Wyandot and presented to British Colonel Henry Proctor. But the incident Beaugrand no doubt concerned himself with the most was the one he was in jail for. Thinking back to that fatal day on January 23, 1813, a large body of Indians painted black and red were spotted approaching Jean-Baptiste Beaugrand's house instead of the anticipated British sleds to transport the American sick and wounded to Fort Malden, Canada. 3 houses on the River Raisin were used as an American hospital, which contained 60 sick and wounded Kentucky soldiers who were burned and shot by vengeful Native Americans led by the Shawnee Tecumseh and the Wyandot Roundhead. Although Beaugrand's actions at the Battle of the River Raisin on January 22, 1813 are unknown, an American private reported that British interpreters, likely Beaugrand and his compatriots, disappeared from the houses before dawn the next day and remained so until the afternoon. Despite Beaugrand's invisibility, the Indians crowded into the houses, opened bureau drawers filled with linens, and began to tear the items apart. Captain Pascal Hickman and several others were knocked down at the door. Major Benjamin Graves and Captain Nathaniel Hart started to leave the room when an Indian turned and tomahawked Hart. Private Thomas Dudley tried to get to Gabriel Godfrey's house to warn the others when he was surrounded by Native Americans and taken captive by an Odawa named McCarty. The Indians pillaged and plundered the houses, stripping American soldiers of their clothing, cash, and personal items, and taking the officers' swords. The attackers then shot or tomahawked the able-bodied and scalped the bedridden, sick, and wounded. Some 49 Kentucky wounded enlisted men and officers were engulfed in smoke and flames from houses set on fire by the Indians. Those American prisoners still alive struggled to get out the windows as the buildings burned to the ground. The few who were strong enough to march were taken by forced march by their Indian captors to Detroit and Fort Malden. Those too weak to walk were killed on the way and left lying on the road in deep snow. It was along that forced march that Beaugrand's experience of the war became more personal than the destruction of his property. Those members of the American regulars and militia who were taken prisoners by the Native Americans suffered an equally dismal fate as those killed at Frenchtown during the massacre. Those who died during their forced march to Detroit and Fort Malden, for the most part, remain unidentified and their stories untold. Only 9 soldiers, one captain, 1 sergeant, and 7 privates, taken captive and tomahawked by the Indians after the massacre, were identified. Ensign Isaac Baker, an American captive at Fort Malden, recorded their names along with some details of their tragic deaths. Baker reported he had witnessed 2 American captives tomahawked at Sandy Creek and 15 to 18 more who suffered the same fate from his interviews with American prisoners at the British hospital in Sandwich. Many fresh scalps were brought into Sandwich with reports of dead American soldiers scattered throughout the country. The fate of Private James Ebenezer Blythe, a member of Captain Nathaniel Hart's company of the 5th Kentucky Volunteer Regiment, is one case where the details and circumstances of his death are known, but this information remained buried in archives until recently. A group of Native Americans with 8 or 10 Kentucky captives, including Blythe, arrived at the mouth of Riviere aux Roches, or Stony Creek, at about 2 p.m. on January 23, 1813, a few miles northeast of the River Raisin. The Indians made a large fire of wooden rails and gave the American prisoners some bread to eat. As they ate, one of the native allies of Great Britain walked up to Blythe, struck him in the head with a tomahawk, and struck him 2 or 3 more times after he fell to the ground. Then Beaugrand, described by Private William Atherton as an old Frenchman, took the weapon from the Indian's hand and gave Blythe the final blow that killed him. 3 other American prisoners recorded Blythe's death without mentioning Beaugrand. Stunned by what they saw, they quickly lost their appetite for the bread given to them. Here, the group split up and members went their separate ways. The next day, January 24th, Atherton and his Indian captor crossed the River Rouge on their way to Fort Malden and stopped at a farm. Atherton identified the owner as Beaugrand, who was jovially conversing and smoking pipes together with his native captor. Atherton promised himself that if the opportunity arose, he would repay Beaugrand for his inhumane act. Beaugrand was at home on his farm on the River Rouge in August 1814 when a detachment of American volunteers commanded by Lieutenant James S. Whitaker, part of Colonel Duncan MacArthur's mounted volunteers in the Detroit area, arrived and confronted him. Whitaker was led to Beaugrand's farm by Private William Atherton, who told Whitaker that the old Frenchman was the one who killed Private Blythe at Stony Creek on January 23, 1813. Beaugrand explained that he had been a prisoner of the British and the Indians and was forced to kill the young Kentuckian, but Atherton said this was a lie because Beaugrand was employed by the enemy at the River Raisin to guard General Winchester's wounded. The American detachment wanted to hang Beaugrand then and there, but Whitaker refused, directing that he be immediately apprehended and taken to the authorities in Detroit. In September 1814, Gabriel Godfrey Sr. was indicted for treason by the United States. He was accused of selling, bartering, and furnishing British officers and their agents with provisions and goods for British Major Adam Muir's expedition to capture Fort Wayne in September 1812. Godfrey claimed he had no choice but to follow Colonel Proctor's orders, which were given under penalty of arrest or exile from the country. At that time, Proctor was the military governor of the Michigan Territory after American General William Hull's surrender of Detroit to Great Britain. No records of the trial exist suggesting that Godfrey was found innocent or the case was dismissed. After the War of 1812, Godfrey went to work for the American government as an Indian agent and interpreter for the Potawatomi Indians. Beaugrand was presented with a bill of indictment for murder that same month and year by the grand jury of the Supreme Court of the Territory of Michigan in the house of John Kinsey, presided over by Judges Augustus Woodward, James Witherill, and John Griffin. The indictment stated Beaugrand, quote, not having the fear of God before his eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil on the 23rd day of January, 1813, unquote, did feloniously, willfully, and with malice strike a certain person, unknown to the jury, with a certain tomahawk in his right hand, and did cut, strike, and thrust upon the head of the prisoner a mortal wound 2.5 inches in breadth and 2 inches in depth, causing the prisoner to die. The indictment was signed by Charles Larned, Attorney General, Michigan Territory. Beaugrand pled not guilty to the charge specified by the Attorney General. On October the 19th, 1814, George Meldrum, George McDougall Jr., Francois LaFontaine, and Francois Navarre were called as witnesses to tell the jury what they knew regarding the incident. Atherton testified for the prosecution. The next day, October 20th, Beaugrand admitted to delivering the final blow to the individual who Beaugrand said was unknown to him, but insisted the Indians told him to do it or else he would be killed. Beaugrand may have considered his action a mercy killing to put an end to the agony and suffering of his victim. During the trial, tempers flared between the French Catholics of Detroit and Kentuckians, with harsh and ignorant words exchanged to the point that Atherton began carrying a loaded rifle for his protection on the streets of Detroit. The jury concluded Beaugrand was guilty of murder of the American soldier, but determined that Beaugrand was under the influence of the devil in the commission of the act. Beaugrand was guilty of murder, but acquitted by reason of being possessed by the devil. It is interesting to speculate why the jury invoked the devil when it issued this strange and unusual verdict. The jury consisted overwhelmingly of French Catholics. Beaugrand may have been viewed as a scapegoat by the jury, who resented Kentuckians calling one of their own a murderer, when others responsible for the injustices committed against the flower of Kentucky went free. The use of the devil may have been a technical ploy by the jury to acquit Beaugrand of Blythe's murder. On the other hand, the jury may indeed have believed that Beaugrand was associated with the devil based on the French folklore of Detroit. Unfortunately, Beaugrand was not as lucky as Godefroy in recovering from the effects of the War of 1812. He operated a little store near Godefroy's residence in Detroit. He lived a marginal existence with his family until 1823, when they removed to Lower Sandusky, now Fremont, Ohio. 3 years after, on March 26, 1826, Beaugrand died and was buried in Whittlesey Cemetery in Lower Sandusky, Ohio. 4 months later, Beaugrand's personal estate was inventoried, and the probated value was $145. Clearly, the War of 1812 had a more debilitating effect on Beaugrand than on Godefroy, since he was never able to regain his previous wealth and influence. Souci is a French-Canadian folk tale that blends fact and fiction, suggesting that Beaugrand was intimately associated with the devil in the disguise of a horse owned by him named Souci, meaning without care, and a man who might be feared by superstitious French Catholics of the Detroit area. The tale relates that many French traders and Indians like Tecumseh, Blackhoof, Walk in the Water, and Okemos, a nephew of Pontiac, socialized at Gabriel Godefroy Sr.'s house and store in Detroit during long winter evenings. Here, wild tales were told around the crackling fire, particularly about the remarkable old mare named Souci, owned by Beaugrand. The horse would visit the cornfields and melon patches of Godefroy's neighbors once a week, before escaping to run a wild gauntlet of musket blasts, thrown sticks and stones, and whips and clubs wielded by angry farmers. Souci responded to their blows by kicking up her heels, scowling, and saluting them by swishing her tail. One night, several traders and Indians were seated around Godefroy's fireplace, finishing a jug of cider, when Okemos demanded stronger drink. Godefroy and his guests, looking for Beaugrand, saw a light in the barn. Peering through the cracks and the chinks in the barn walls, they saw Beaugrand and Souci sitting at a table playing cards, while they poured something that looked like melted brass into a cup and drank it. When Godefroy kicked the barn door open, Souci leaped out the window. The group accused Beaugrand of witchcraft, but he insisted that he was only brewing a little cider on the coals in his loft, and that his mare would be found asleep in the stable below. In 1805, Detroit was burned to the ground by a massive fire. The fire destroyed all houses and buildings except for one, which was attributed to the work of the diabolical and infamous Nain Rouge, or Red Dwarf. French folklore held this disdainful little demon was Detroit's harbinger of doom, going back to the days of Antoine Lomé de la Mothe, Sieur de Cadillac, who founded Fort Pontchartrain, now Detroit, in July 1701. Tales told the little red man summoned the flames of the great fire as retribution against the long-dead Cadillac. Others reported to William Hall, governor of Detroit in 1805, that speculators in the lumber trade deliberately set the town to fire to profit from the sale of timber to the needy inhabitants. Irrespective of the cause, Detroit was reduced to cinders and ash in about an hour. The Souci tale states that fire destroyed Godefroy's barn, which contained the charred remains of the old mare who many thought had been carried off by the devil in a cloud of smoke. Other French residents claimed they saw the sinister Nain Rouge grinning and chuckling on the roof of Godfrey's barn just before it collapsed. It was said that after General Winchester's defeat and massacre at the river raisin, Okemos and his Ojibwa were persuaded to join the American cause by Godfrey, who was thought to be a man of big medicine for his association with spiritual evil, referring to Beaugrand. Could Beaugrand's trial for murder have ended with the Franco-American jury acquitting the former traitor and militiaman based on cultural allegiance and belief in witchcraft? Who knows? You decide. Slides 16 and 17 show the selected references used for the making of this YouTube video.